Back in 2001, I took a class up at the College of the Redwoods, and I met a very famous woodworker by the name of Jim Krenoff, and I was really honored to have a class with him there. If you're a woodworker and understand who Krenoff was, that's like, you know, meeting Babe Ruth in baseball. Anyway, I am doing a video today that's a little bit different. I'm going to take you on a little tour of some of the plants and some of the things that I've introduced into my garden. And the topic is really about invasive species. But I'm going to touch on a few other items and a few other diseases, and I hope you follow along. You know, if you're interested in gardening or you're interested in learning more about your trees and your plants, I think you'll find this video valuable. And do me a favor, would you pass it on to somebody who is like-minded and loves trees and loves to learn about plants? Because I'm really trying to grow this channel, and the only way that this channel is going to grow is if you guys help me. So thanks a lot. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe, and always leave me a comment. I love the comments. I'd like to talk a little bit about invasive species. Now, when it comes to trees, there are a lot of trees that will perpetuate themselves, and they will reroot and they'll spread their seeds, and they become rather invasive. There's a lot of trees that are not native to our area that really don't belong here, and in many cases they can take over. Take the ailanthus, for instance. One ailanthus can become a forest of ailanthus trees. Black acacia, that's another interesting tree. I have seen whole areas of black acacia self-perpetuate themselves to a point of where, you know, you can have one tree in 15, 20 years, you'll have 50 or 60 trees. And there are also a lot of trees that will send up sprouts from their roots. Now, the same thing goes for a lot of plants that we bring into our garden. And this is an interesting plant right here. I've been told that this is called a forget-me-not. And I've also got another plant up here that I'll show you in a second here, called a feverfew. Feverfew comes up everywhere. Here's what the flowers look like. And it's a pretty plant, and it's a medicinal plant, but be careful. If you have feverfew in your yard, it can take over. Interesting story about these two plants. They're all over the place. They're everywhere on my property. But 28 years ago, when I bought this property, I was gifted a flower basket by my mother. And in it, there was a feverfew plant, and there was some of these pretty little flowers, forget-me-nots, I think they're called. And they went to seed. And the next year, there was a few of them here and there, and they went to seed, and they went to seed, and they went to seed. And it has infiltrated a large portion of my property. Now, fortunately, these are really pretty, and I kind of like them. So I don't mind that they have somewhat taken over, but there are other plants that are so aggressive and so invasive that they can actually ruin your garden. And another good example is ivy. Let's go take a look at some ivy. Now, this area of the yard is sort of a accumulation of a lot of different plants that keep coming up. I keep fighting the ones that I don't want here, like the blackberry vines. They're constantly coming up, as well as the poison oak. Oh yes, lovely. I'm not going to touch it. But the ivy comes up everywhere, and I didn't plant it. And the ivy has taken over all my flower beds, my rhododendron beds, all the areas that I don't really want the ivy to grow. But it is kind of a nice filler, keeps things looking green. It's kind of nice and consistent. But if you look up into the woods here, it can be so invasive and so difficult to get rid of that I never recommend ivy. You know, people say, I want something that's going to fill in and be nice and green all year round. And years ago, the Algerian ivy, there's a whole bunch of different types of ivy, by the way, but this particular type of ivy was introduced, and I cannot tell you how many yards that I work on that everything is ivy. Everywhere you look, including my yard, I've got ivy coming up everywhere. So once in a while, I got to get in there and root it out and gut it out and get as much of it as I can, and clear my pathways, and seems like a never-ending job. Now, Vinca is another plant that can take over. This is some Vinca that was here before I bought the property, and it has continued to evolve. Really pretty purple flowers. There's Vinca major and Vinca minor. This is the minor with the smaller flowers, and it can take over a whole area. Now, if you're trying to use it as a ground cover, it's not a bad ground cover, but in this case, I'm constantly fighting all the other invasives, which are actually kind of native to the area, including blackberry vines. So here's another invasive plant that I put in years ago and has taken over. It's wild strawberry. It just seems to spread all over the place. It reseeds itself and goes all over the yard. So I have a lot of pretty things coming in right now. I've got a lot of rhododendrons. There's one of my little Japanese maples that's coming in. But what a mess. This used to be so beautiful. If you're not on top of it all the time, it turns into an overwhelming task. And the ivy, oh my God, the ivy. Planted a bunch of these little native irises here, and they come up quite well, but the ivy will choke them out. So if I don't get in there and root out and gut out all of this invasive stuff, then the ivy wins. And if you look in here, this is where some of the Vinca was. And this should all be Vinca in here, which is a little bit slower growing, but once the ivy gets started, the ivy wins. And it's so hard to get out. I mean, you could start pulling on it, but the roots break off and they keep coming back. So I've got a major yard cleanup to do in my space. One thing I can say about my yard is because I work in so many other people's yards that I purchase very, very few plants. I take cuttings, or I'll take a little small piece that's rooted and I'll bring them in, and as long as I keep them watered, they evolve. There's a couple of calla lilies in here. Look at that one's about ready to bloom. That's really pretty. Those came from somebody's yard. I just brought in a couple of calla lilies and they seem to root themselves and new calla lilies come up. And people are often asking me about color in their garden. And one plant that I really like to recommend a lot is the geranium. It is so easy to propagate. I've never bought a geranium. I just take a chunk, stick it in the ground, and it grows. But, you know, I like to add other different types of plants. Now, this is an interesting little area. I've tried gladiolas a lot in the past, and the gophers get them and the animals get them. So I just tried to put some of them, I tried this time to put some of them in a cage that I built. It's got an over cage and an under cage. And if you look closely, you'll see that there's a bottom portion that is, about 18 inches deep. And it's just like the top here, and it goes down. And so far, the gladiolas are able to survive this way. I'm gonna have to pull the cage off now because they're starting to grow into it. But when there's a will, there's a way. Let's see if they work for me this year. Now, I love a wild garden. I've been accused of being kind of a throw it together type of a gardener, and that's true because I'm always just bringing home seeds and scattering seeds and putting stuff in the ground and kind of letting it grow natural. And there's a lot of different types of gardeners. Most of the clients I work for are organized gardeners. Everything has to be in its space. Everything has to be planted in an order. Well, I'm a haphazard gardener. And it works for me. I'm okay with that. But you have to learn how to identify what you want and what you don't want. And sometimes even the stuff that you want becomes too much. And I've got a number of extraordinary rhododendrons that are just now starting to open up. That one's just opening. Look at all these buds. Oh, this is going to be amazing. I love the rhododendron. Now, I dug up a Tasmanian tree fern years ago that the client said was dead. I had just dug up this thing right here and kept the roots, and it didn't have any fronds on it whatsoever. So I put it in the ground and started watering it throughout 1, then 2, then 5, and it's evolved into something beautiful. Now, it doesn't like the frost that much, but it seems to tolerate it. So Was that a good choice? That's the only one I've got on the property. There's a lot of native ferns around here, but I've put it in a spot where it just doesn't get direct sun all year round. It gets a little bit of sun, so it seems to be enjoying that location. If you're going to plant ferns, you have to really monitor the amount of sunshine that they get. Too much sun, they burn. Not enough sun, they won't thrive. So choose ferns wisely and really understand the sun rotation as well as the time in each portion of the yard that you're trying to work with. Now, this is an interesting story here. This tree was a purple leaf flowering plum. I planted it when I first moved in. Almost immediately, a big buck came along and used his horns and scraped all the bark off. Next thing I knew, it was flat on the ground, so I just cut it down. Well, this came back from the rootstock, and it came up and it's turned into a giant non-fruit bearing plum. I've actually tried grafting a fruit bearing plum onto this with no success. I'm not even sure what the variety is. It's kind of blocking my view, but I've never really had the heart to cut it down. It is getting to be a little bit overwhelming. I have a patio area down here. I do have to cut it back so I can live with my patio area. Sometimes the choices we make end up evolving into something that you may or may not like. Now, this is also interesting. This is a boxwood, a Japanese boxwood. And an area of a property that I was working on was being altered and they didn't care about it, so I dug it up and I brought it home, but it was only about a foot high when I planted it, and I've not really trained it like people normally square off boxwoods. I let it grow natural, but what I've discovered is it's deer proof. I have never seen deer nibbling on this plant. I'm always trying to figure out which plants will thrive and which plants will survive in an area that gets a lot of foliage-eating wildlife. Euryopsis is another plant that the deer don't seem to eat. This one is just a few flowers on it, but when it flowers, the whole thing is a blaze of yellow. It's a really, really pretty plant. Hardy plant, stays green all year round. Not many flowers on it right now, but I like that plant. Also, deer resistant or deer proof. I've never seen deer eating this. And boy, do I have my work cut out for me for grass whipping. Oh, this is an annual job. And unfortunately, there's some poison oak that comes up in here, so I gotta be really, really careful. I bundle up really well. I put a face mask on. I put heavy duty gloves on. And if I'm really lucky, I don't get poison oak. So to wrap this up, my property is almost 20 acres and it is a very natural property up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Now there are a lot of unfortunates. The unfortunates are many of the species of trees like the tan oaks are succumbing to the Phytophthora disease, and I literally have about 100 of them that are dead on the property right now. There's also a number of madrones that are falling susceptible to a disease called Botryosphaeria, and sadly some of them are dying from the top down, some of them are completely dead, but it seems to be less of a problem than the Phytophthora problem with the tan oaks. And finally, I've got a number of fir trees that are dead and dying. There's one off in the distance there. I cut them down periodically. Last year I cut down 3 or 4 dead ones. There's 2 more dead ones over there and some more off in the distance. So that's really sad because I love the fir trees. There's a big one off in the distance there. Hey, thanks for taking a little tour of my property with me, and I want you to think long and hard about the plants that you should or should not plant in your yard and which ones can end up owning your yard.